Hello, and welcome to the Meditation Center's monthly metaphysical lesson. Today's lesson is inspired by the book of Jonah, chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, which read, "Those deceived by worthless things lose their chance for mercy, but me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. That which I have promised, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to God." And so it reads. The story of Jonah and the big fish is one of the better-known stories of the Old Testament, but I wonder how many people really think about what it means. The book of Jonah is 4 short chapters telling the story of Jonah and how he disobeyed God, was swallowed by a big fish, and then rescued by God's grace when he decided to comply. Let's go back to the beginning. In the first chapter, a personified God instructs Jonah to go to the city of Nineveh and preach against it because of its wickedness. But Jonah decided to run away rather than face such an uncomfortable responsibility, and instead he went to Joppa and caught a boat headed for the city of Tarshish. A great storm came and frightened everyone on the boat. The people on the boat prayed, but Jonah was asleep below deck. The captain woke him and told him to pray too. They felt that someone on the ship was to blame for the terrible storm that was punishing them, so they drew lots to determine who should take responsibility. The lot fell on Jonah, and they asked him questions about who he is and where he was from. When he told them he was a Hebrew and he was running away from God, they got scared. They asked him what he had done for such punishment. As the storm intensified, they felt like they needed to do something to him to seek relief. Jonah told them to throw him into the sea. He believed it would make the storm subside if he sacrificed himself. They tried to get to shore, but couldn't, and ultimately they honored his request and threw him overboard. The sea calmed. Meanwhile, Jonah was struggling in the water. God sent a big fish, sometimes characterized as a whale, to swallow him. For 3 days and nights, he stayed inside the fish, praying to God. Finally, God had the fish expel him onto dry land, and he was safe. After this, Jonah went ahead and did what he had originally been told to do. He had his challenges along the way, but the people of Nineveh became more aware of their ways, and Jonah became more aware of his too. Now, this is a fantastic story. I wouldn't expect anyone to take it literally, but true or not, there are important lessons that it teaches. It isn't hard for us to feel like Jonah from time to time, overwhelmed by our responsibilities to the point that we want to just run away and never come back. And if we do, we must then take responsibility for the consequences. That's really what this story is all about, not just for Jonah, but the people of Nineveh and us. Let's take a look at the scripture from a metaphysical point of view. The Hebrew meaning of the name Jonah sheds light on the complexities of his consciousness and ours. Jonah means a dove or dove-like, warm, affectionate, lovable, loving, fruitful, productive, fertile, effervescent, passionate, oppressive, violent, intoxicating, and destructive. It's kind of all over the place. Many good and productive qualities, but also destructive qualities, much like we exhibit from time to time, depending on our circumstances. Jonah is like the average Joe, reflecting the spectrum of our human tendencies. Metaphysically, Jonah represents a prophetic mind, which, if not used with divine love, binds us to a belief that the effects of karma, or the law of cause and effect, cannot be redeemed or forgiven. In other words, Jonah is the part of our consciousness that can sometimes believe that we are beyond hope and that we don't deserve better. Nineveh, the city where Jonah was supposed to travel, is the seat of the natural animal forces in our physical consciousness. It's the part of us that does what we want, not necessarily what we should do. This is why Jonah was sent to help them. But his consciousness wasn't that much different, was it? Tarshish, the city where Jonah chose to go instead, represents the hard, unyielding, argumentative, battering, demolishing tendency that is characteristic of a purely intellectual and reasoning nature. Like Jonah, it's a place in consciousness where we tend to beat ourselves up for what we think we should do or the way we think things should be. On the way to Tarshish, Jonah had to go to Joppa, which is a place in consciousness where we appreciate beauty. Water represents our emotions. It also has an aspect of cleansing. When we're faced with challenges, it's our emotions that make things seem stressful, even when they might not be. But once we gain perspective in our situation, the same challenges can give us a sense of accomplishment as we successfully work through them. The fish represents ideas of multiplication. This is a strange concept, but if you think about it, when we're tied up in our thoughts, they tend to grow and take on a life of their own. The big fish, the really pressing ideas, can overwhelm us until we're forced to sit with them, work with them, and through them, and then move past them. Only then will they release their hold on our mind and our consciousness. There are other interpretations of the fish. Elizabeth Sand Turner, who wrote extensively about metaphysical interpretation of Scripture, saw the fish as us falling into a disastrous state of affairs. Others interpret it as divine ideas. All of these interpretations have merit and serve well to teach us about what the story means about us. The dry land Jonah ends up on represents a more even state of mind that we find after we calm our emotions and see things more clearly. And of course, we don't see God as a person controlling and commanding us, but rather the universal laws of nature in action. The law of cause and effect and the law of attraction are at play here, affecting how we perceive the situations we encounter based on the energies we draw to us in response to them. This passage tells the story of our own consciousness and how we sometimes react to our situations, where our intellect deceives us into thinking we're helpless. We try to head for places of beauty that will make us feel better, that greener grass on the other side of the fence. But until we reconcile this mindset, we may end up in an even more destructive place. Along the way, the big fish, our overwhelming thoughts, or our disastrous state of affairs, can capture and consume us. But as we stop, meditate, and put everything in a proper perspective, we realize that we can handle a lot more than we think we can. As we achieve this new perspective, these divine ideas release us. We begin to realize that life isn't always gloom and doom, and it's possible for things to turn out fine, even if we get a little intimidated by them along the way. What a wonderful lesson! And we go through this process a lot more often than we realize. Some folks more than others. The story of Jonah always reminds me of the Walt Disney version of the story of Pinocchio. Pinocchio is a puppet who was cherished by Geppetto, the man who crafted him. But he felt like he wasn't good enough. He wanted to be a real boy, which didn't seem possible or feasible. Like Jonah, he sometimes thought he would be better off not existing at all, and concluded that he must be a disappointment to Geppetto. This is his Jonah consciousness, that he is beyond hope and that there's nothing anyone can do about it, even his own conscience. When he ran away, he went to places that seemed wonderful and fun, like Joppa, but ended up turning scary and intimidating, like Tarshish. During his adventures, he heard news that Geppetto had been swallowed by a whale and became determined to find and rescue him. He ended up being swallowed by the whale too. If Pinocchio is Jonah, then perhaps Geppetto is a representation of God or the universe, inspiring and guiding Pinocchio to where he needed to be. Once inside the whale, they were forced to work past their emotional responses and figure out how to escape. After some contemplation, they came up with a plan to light a fire, which caused the whale to cough and sneeze, and they were expelled, much like Jonah was from the big fish. After going through this trauma, they could see more clearly that happiness wasn't as far as Pinocchio thought it was. With a clearer perspective, Pinocchio realized he wasn't a scared, rigid wooden puppet anymore. He overcame the intimidating thoughts that held him back, and he realized, quite literally in this case, that he can accomplish exactly what he wanted, to be a real boy. And he did. And of course, they all lived happily ever after. The parallels between Pinocchio and Jonah are pretty obvious, but the lesson is no less significant. But things like this happen in real life too. A friend of mine, we'll call him Anton, grew up in a difficult family situation. He was the youngest child of a divorced single mother. She had to work long hours in the restaurant of a country club where the members were wealthy and affluent. Until he became an adult, Anton spent much of his time at the club, often out of necessity, when family members couldn't watch him while his mom was working. He had a tendency to feel less than, because he thought his meager life could never compare to the kids of wealthy families he spent so much time around. He ended up making up stories about where he went to school, and as he grew older, this expanded into stories about a degree that he never earned and a job working for Congress that he also never had. Anton created a myth that he then felt he needed to live by. He bought expensive clothes and furnishings, and even wore colored contact lenses because he thought he would be perceived more positively with blue eyes. He was so determined to live his fantasy that he wouldn't let anyone see him without his blue contact lenses, even the people closest to him. In reality, it was pretty obvious they weren't real, but he had to stick to his story. He spent so many years living this fictional life and following what he thought were other people's expectations that he had never learned to really just be himself. He spent so much money to get nice things, all so he could perpetuate the myth. He was a perfect example of Jonah, warm, affectionate, lovable, loving, effervescent, but also oppressive, intoxicating, and destructive, usually to himself. He lived behind a mask, and whenever he was asked to take responsibility for his reality, he tended to run from it. He would compensate by partying a lot and entertaining his friends, creating what he saw as beauty, like Joppa, but ultimately running himself into overwhelming debt and a feeling of hopelessness, like Tarshish. His family did their best to convince him to stop living the imaginary life he had created for himself. But giving in would show others the weaknesses he saw in himself. The situation snowballed until one day he had a confrontation with his manager and was let go from his job. The big fish he was running from finally caught up with him and swallowed him. He couldn't pay his bills, he lost his car, he lost friends, and he lost his home. It was a sad thing to see. But being in that situation, like Jonah, forced him to think about what was really important. He couldn't afford to wait for his idea of a perfect job. He had to straighten his life out now. He had to learn to be himself, his real self, not the one he created for everyone else to see. He ditched the contact lenses, he quit smoking, he took the first job he could get, which happened to be selling cars. For once, his friends, his family, his world got to see the real Anton, and he was free. He sold his first car the week before Christmas. He came home with his tie cut in half, a tradition in the car business when you make your first sale. And more importantly, he had a commission check. He had found purpose in achieving something meaningful that was real. He had found a sense of satisfaction he had never known, because he was free from having to spend even one brief moment perpetuating the intricate performance that had held him back for so long. He was at peace. The big fish had expelled him onto dry land, and now he could be the genuine person he always wanted to be, but never had the strength to do. The future, for the first time, looked honest and bright. That would be a wonderful end to the story, but there's a little bit more. They say we follow our life path until we learn all of the lessons we need to learn. I believe this is true. Anton had health issues, and because of his financial predicament, he had started conserving the important medication that kept him healthy. That night, the same day he sold the car, the same day he found his peace, Anton had a stroke. A few nights later, right after Christmas, when no one else was around in the hospital, he quietly stepped out of his physical body, happy and at peace. Though it was sad for the loved ones he left behind, it was an amazing thing to personally witness a person achieving their purpose in life and going out on top. God bless Anton. Now, of course, for most of us, our challenges aren't quite that dramatic, though they may seem so at times. But they're no less significant, and they may seem no less overwhelming, and they certainly are no less important on our path of growth and understanding. The key is to allow ourselves space to work with our responsibilities, our disappointments, our challenges, rather than running away from them, or hiding from them, or ignoring them, or whatever our human consciousness tries to do to protect us from the things that frighten or intimidate us. When we accept what we need to do and focus on getting it done, instead of feeling hopeless or overwhelmed, we dodge the big fish entirely. But even if it catches us, we can take time to contemplate and understand where we are, and take the path that frees us from the burdens we so often impose on ourselves. I'll close with Jonah's prayer, which he spoke from his heart while trapped in the belly of the fish. This was his moment of realization that he had the power to overcome his challenges instead of running away from them. The last two verses are our scripture lesson today. I called out to God in my distress, and God answered me. From the belly of the underworld I cried out for help. You have heard my voice. You had cast me into the depths in the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounds me. All your strong waves and rushing water passed over me. So I said, I've been driven away from your sight. Will I ever look on your holy temple? Waters have grasped me to the point of death. The deep surrounds me. Seaweed is trapped around my head at the base of the undersea mountains. I have sunk down to the underworld. Its bars held me with no end in sight. But you brought me out of the pit. When my endurance was weakening, I remembered God, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those deceived by worthless things lose their chance for mercy, but me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. That which I have promised, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to God. We spend so much time on worthless things, things that don't serve us well. We can put so much value on material possessions and distorted ideas that we easily lose sight of what's really important and meaningful. These things become distractions that can lead us to feelings of hopelessness, because true happiness and satisfaction are so easily obscured by them. Verse 8 tells us, those deceived by worthless things lose their chance for mercy, not because someone is denying us mercy, but because we're denying it of ourselves. Verse 9 continues, that which I have promised, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to God. When we commit to being the best person we can be, not the imaginary mask we have created for others to see, but our genuine self, there's nothing that can hold us back. And the universe responds accordingly. Find your peace. Find your purpose, and live it every day. Namaste. For additional lessons and meditation ideas, visit our website at www.meditatewnc.org. Thank you for joining us.